Welcome everybody to the November Animal Care Wednesday webinar. I'm Heidi Carroll with SDSU Extension up in South Dakota, and the Animal Care Wednesday webinars are a four-state collaboration between South Dakota, Iowa, Missouri, and Nebraska Extension and 4-H professionals. We focus our topics around animal care, hot industry topics that have an impact on animal care or well-being. And so today's topic is going to kind of focus on transportation of cattle specifically. Some of these may apply to other species, but most of it is going to focus directly to cattle. A couple of housekeeping items. You'll see a chat box feature. That is where you'll have the opportunity to type any questions, and you can type those at any time for our speaker. If it's something urgent, we'll address it during the presentation. Otherwise, we'll likely ask all those questions at the end of both presenters. If you have technical difficulties, go ahead and use the chat box feature to communicate those with me as well. Not seeing anybody having any issues, I think we'll go ahead and get started with the presentations. I want to welcome Chase DeCoite, who is the Director of Beef Quality Assurance with National Cattlemen's Beef Association. His presentation is going to focus on the Beef Quality Assurance Transportation Program, or maybe you've seen the BQA acronym across some media. He's going to kind of give us an update on that program, and then after Chase, we're going to transition over to Allison Rivera, who's the Executive Director of Government Affairs with NCBA at the Center for Public Policy. And she's going to kind of focus a little bit more on some of the federal commercial trucker regulations that have definitely been at Washington, D.C., and definitely across the U.S. In the media as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chase, and we'll get started.
Great. Thanks, Heidi, and thanks everyone for joining today. It's a privilege to talk to you guys and let you know a little bit about what we're doing with the BQA Transportation Program and kind of give you some background there. So like Heidi said, I'm with the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, headquartered here in our Denver office, where we work with folks like Heidi and many others that are probably on the phone as our BQA coordinators throughout the countryside, and appreciate their efforts as boots on the ground delivering that BQA message of the programming that we work on here. So BQA Transportation, quickly, just a little bit of history. Many of you are probably very aware of the Beef Quality Assurance, or BQA program, which has been around for about 30 years now, and has allowed the industry to make significant strides in regards to beef quality, reduction of product defects, and overall improvement of cattle management through education of beef producers across the country. And so as we worked on BQA, the 2016 National Beef Quality Audit, which was released, or the results were released in 2017, had some significant findings around aspects that we can improve, specifically in the transportation realm. And we noticed an increase in frequency of bruising, although those bruises were more minor than had previously been found in previous quality audits. The frequency and location of them indicated that we may see some issues occurring during transportation. And so to address some of those issues, as well as kind of the natural evolution of the BQA program, we decided to create and establish BQA Transportation, which will now cover our industry from pasture to plate with BQA principles and management guidelines. And so I think that's a real strength for us, for the cattle community, and improving beef quality overall. So that's some background. I'm going to jump in now into what the BQAT program looks like and how it's structured. So we offer in-person and online trainings for this. We execute in-person trainings through folks like Heidi and probably some of you on the phone through a full suite of in-person training resources, and we have an online program. In both of those situations, we have two different audience focuses that kind of decide the track of what those trainings look like. We have the professional track or modules, and we have the farmer rancher track. The professional track is geared towards those hauling cattle longer distances and in equipment that is similar to what you see there in the presentation. Cattle pots, tractor trailer type equipment, and hauling cattle. Usually this is occurring in situations where cattle are arriving to a feed yard or going to a feed yard to a packer, or in some of those larger cattle states like you all are from, potentially moving cattle between operations at different points in their life cycle or in the production cycle. And so really the content and what we're teaching and the principles is not different for these audiences. What's different is the examples, the language, and the style with which we're teaching to best reach those folks. The farmer rancher track focuses mostly on those who are using, a pickup and a gooseneck trailer, hauling cattle shorter distances. Maybe that's the fair or to a local auction market, or in those situations where they're just hauling lighter loads or smaller loads to a local processing plant, or potentially a lot of those dairy producers that are hauling cattle to various destinations. So we've kept that in mind in the design of the program and with the content that we're reaching them with. Both of these programs are geared towards beef and dairy producers. We worked closely with the dairy industry to incorporate some examples that include dairy cattle, depending on who's taking the training. And obviously the principles are applicable to both industries, especially in the transportation segment, where there are little differences there. This goes through kind of the sequence and what folks can expect and the types of content that are covered in each of these programs. And you can see just how similar the programs really are. Like I mentioned, they're exactly the same in regards to their structure and in regards to the topics. But the examples as they go down through it and the content that's there is going to be geared towards their segment, their style of hauling and transportation. So we cover an introduction level of BQA Transportation. In this area, we kind of share with them the reasons why BQA Transportation is important, why the education around proper transportation is important to the cattle industry, the beef business, and how it can improve consumer confidence, and how negatives of various transportation practices could impact beef quality. Then we talk about principles of stockmanship, using animal instinct to the benefit of loading cattle, of what we need to be cognizant of when hauling cattle, and properly handling those. Now, in a lot of these situations when we're dealing with drivers whose job primarily is as a hauler or a long distance driver, they're not fully aware of cattle instinct, or not always familiar with those stockmanship principles. So for them, that's many times it's an aha moment. There's some light bulbs that you can see going off across the room when you do these in-person trainings. And we see folks when they do the online modules, spending a decent amount of time with the activities that we have here for them to better understand stockmanship. We also cover biosecurity, which might be one of the most important aspects of the transportation training, and something that we really need to get across to these folks, particularly if there were to ever be a foreign animal disease outbreak, a foot and mouth disease outbreak, something of that sort that could halt the transport of cattle across our country, and properly transporting cattle to ensure a minimal risk of the disease transfer is important. And so A lot of times, folks, there we do cover things that could be implemented to improve biosecurity, practices that could become necessities during the event of a foreign animal disease outbreak. That is all covered in that biosecurity area. And I know that some of the feedback we get there is that some of it is not realistic, you know, and we understand that some of it is things like making sure you're using different clothing and things like that when you're going to a new operation or an operation with increased risk, things like that. We know that that's not necessarily everyday practice, but those are practices that we want to make people aware of in the event that it becomes a necessity. Fitness for transport, another topic that we cover that's really a highlight. Something that a lot of people don't always consider or realize is that the auction market is not the final destination for that animal. Not only do they need to be fit to reach the auction market, but they need to be fit to be hauled and transported beyond that. They need to be able to reach their final destination. And sometimes that can be hours and hundreds, if not thousands of miles away. And we particularly saw that in the National Beef Quality Audit around our market cows and bulls, which reach not just the beef industry, but the dairy industry, that the average length of travel on those animals was much longer. And so that's the concern when we're sending potential coal animals that might not be fit or able to make it the entire trip. So we really make people aware of that and provisions and practices that they can implement to improve those situations. Pre-trip planning and loading. This here, a lot of the content actually is about improving communication within the beef supply chain or within the production chain. And so that is encouraging drivers and producers to communicate with their drivers and or their hauling companies prior to the arrival of that truck on their operation to pick up those cattle, working with folks to make sure that they're going to bring the proper trailer, that they know how many animals they're going to have on that truck, and how far those animals are going. So that is covered there, as well as obviously things like proper precautions and guidelines around potentially negative weather impacts, road construction, and the like. On the road, arrival and unloading, a lot of that is just around safe driving while you're on the road, always having a plan B in case there's a road closure, in case you reach inclement weather, things like that. And then on unloading, having a facility that is ready for those cattle to arrive. Again, communication when they're going to arrive, the condition that the cattle might be coming in on, and making sure that you have adequate facilities ready for the arrival of those animals. And then we go into risk management and emergency management. Obviously important to cover off on what folks need to do in the event of an emergency, in the event of an accident on the road, and things like that. So we cover off on that. All of this culminates in a 30-question quiz where they can achieve their certification. A little bit around our online learning management system. So these are constructed along that same course sequence that I just covered, but we launched these in 2017, actually launched the entire BQA program in November 2017. And so launched with the online and in-person offerings that we work with our state coordinators on. And so these are designed for all segments of our industry and reaching them with BQAT content, whether you're a cow-calf producer or a feed yard producer or those stocker backgrounders. The content I think is adequate for all of those segments of the beef industry, and then obviously those module types that I touched on earlier. That there is just a screenshot to kind of see what the modules look like. They're fully interactive. Folks are encouraged to click on them. It's not just video based, although there is a lot of video content in there. It's video content and interactive activities that encourage learning and absorption of those materials. our in-person training tools. So these are training kits that we have disseminated through many state coordinators and help them put together an in-person training. These are very robust. They include PowerPoint presentations, but also in-person activity ideas and plans that can be implemented on an in-person training. By no means do we expect somebody to cover in any one of these in-person trainings, because they do have enough content, enough activities to honestly fill probably a 6-hour training if you really wanted to. But we have many people that obviously don't have that much time and need to cover the content, so maybe they create a training that's less activity based, more PowerPoint based, or vice versa. So really working with your audience and the time that you have allotted is important in these in-person training environments. We also provide a whole set of marketing tools to advertise and promote in-person trainings, including posters that can be used at sale barns, creatives and graphics that can be used in different situations to reach your potential audience for an in-person training. A little bit about, and I know that in Heidi's email to you all, talking about content that we're covering today, I do want to touch on some of the supply chain requirements that we're seeing around BQA and BQAT. And so most of the major packers have made announcements requiring BQA of producers that sell to them, particularly around the fed cattle environment. And so most of those go into effect around BQA on January 1, 2019. So we're reaching that deadline, if you will, pretty rapidly. And I know our state coordinators and BQA trainers across the country have been busy hosting in-person trainings. We've also seen significant uptake of the online platform as many producers prepare for those requirements. At the same time, many of them also announced a subsequent transportation certification requirement that will be made mandatory of haulers delivering cattle to the facilities of these packers by January 1, 2020. So an additional year to accomplish that for that trucking community, for anybody hauling cattle, but they will be requiring it of those arriving on their facilities by January 1, 2020. If there's any indications that we learned from the BQA requirement, there will likely be requirement deadlines ahead of the announced requirement date, just to make sure that they are in compliance by January 1, 2020. I wouldn't doubt that if by September and October of 2019 we start seeing some of the plants impose those requirements, so that they don't have to turn away trucks on January 1, 2020. They have those drivers aware of the upcoming requirements. Just a little bit around the numbers and the uptake that we've seen around the BQA transportation program. This includes in-person certifications and online. You can see there, since November of 2017, we've had over 2,100 certifications. Over 440 of those have been through in-person trainings. 501 farmer rancher certifications have been deployed, over 1,100 professional certifications. And then obviously there, the top 5 states in regards to BQA transportation, 3 of those 5 are involved in who we're talking to today. So that's great. And then just happy to answer any questions. I think Heidi has that prepared to occur after Allison's presentation. So I know, Heidi, you wanted me to keep this to around 15 minutes, and hopefully I did that.
Well, great, Chase. I think you kind of gave the great overview, the reasons why we're doing it and why we need to keep producers aware of what's going on to get them meeting industry expectations and our consumers and the general public's expectations for BQA transportation. So now we're going to transition over to Allison Rivera, and she is going to kind of give us the federal overview and touch on a few other topics related to transportation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Heidi. I appreciate being able to share some information with everybody today. Heidi, can everyone see the slide?
Yes, it looks good.
Okay, perfect. So as Heidi said, I am here in the DC office of NCBA. We have a large team that handles a lot of different issues, and one of the issues that I work on every day is transportation. A lot of the stuff that Chase talked about today certainly has implications on kind of some of the policy items in this area that we are continuing to work on. One thing I did want to mention that I figured would be important to this group is truck weights. Truck weights is still something that a lot of different entities in the trucking world are continuing to work on. This is obviously something that's very important to producers out there. And so NCBA has joined a coalition called the Safer Hauling and Infrastructure Protection Coalition, because again, when we ask for things like increased truck weights, we want to make sure that safety is one of the first words that comes out of our mouth. So we joined this coalition that includes all kinds of different organizations, from those who are from paper companies to our friends in the beer industry and cola industry, all the way to us and Cargill and other livestock groups. So this coalition has been working with members of Congress to try to essentially get even just a pilot program of 10 states to allow 91,000 pounds on 6 axles. The way the pilot program would work is that these 10 states would have a couple of years to run these heavier trucks, and then the safety data and any other helpful data would be collected, and they would DOT would take that data and hopefully would work with Congress to expand the truck weights. Truck weights is one of those issues that Republicans and Democrats alike kind of have concerns on both sides. There's a lot of pushback that comes from our friends in the railroad industry. Obviously, there's some competition issues there. And then a lot of the safety groups don't want to see heavier trucks on the road. So we continue to work with this coalition to try to get some wiggle room on truck weight. So I just wanted to kind of mention that as one of the things we're working on. So let's take a step back. I take for granted, but I'm assuming that everyone on this joining this webinar knows what an ELD is, but just in case, I put a picture of one of, there's over 300 options out there for people to purchase. So this is just one of many that are available. But just a little bit of information about kind of what it is. It's attached to the truck's engine. There is a little known fact that if you have a truck that has an engine that is built earlier than 2001, you are automatically exempt from ELDs, because the ELDs do not work with those engines. So when that announcement came out, let's just say there was a hot market for engines built earlier than 2001. Again, it attaches to the engine and sends the data back to FMCSA, and this device takes the place of the written logbooks. And this was mandated by Congress. So this is kind of a graphic that we whipped up here at NCBA to kind of share on the Hill and let people know where we've come and where we're going. We have been sitting on quite a few exemptions. The first exemption from the ELD for livestock haulers came from Congress. And it was not from Congress, from FMCSA. And that exemption was actually for anyone hauling ag commodities. And that one lasted for about 90 days. The exemptions that happened after that came from the work of the livestock group specifically, and those came through Congress. They came through the appropriations process. We have been able to get across to our friends on the Hill that the biggest issue for the ELDs and for livestock haulers is that, again, we are hauling live animals, and that there are issues not just with the ELDs themselves and the over 300 that are on the market, but there are issues with current hours of service. So right now, livestock haulers are sitting under another ELD exemption that lasts until December 7th. It was inside the continuing resolution that Congress passed before they recessed. We have to do something before December 7th. The good news is there is language in both the House and Senate transportation appropriations bills. So we should be under another exemption after December 7th that lasts until September 30th of 2019. So again, this is the transportation, the appropriation language that is in there. So you can see that it exempts livestock haulers, but it also exempts our bee hauling friends, which I know is definitely a thing in the Dakotas, and as well as fish haulers who are coming up from the southern states. So we are grateful to have that language and to have the support from both the House and Senate. So one of the things that's gone on through this process of all of these transportation discussions is that this administration and this FMCSA realized that the exemption that currently exists on the front end of a haul for those hauling ag commodities, the 150 air mile exemption, needed some guidance. There were a lot of people that were happy to have this exemption but didn't know exactly how to use it, and they wanted to make sure that when they were using it, they were certainly doing it correctly, so that when they got pulled over, there weren't any issues. So FMCSA put out some guidance at the end of May, and I think one of the more helpful issues was that when you can see my example at the front, if I keep my truck at my farm and I drive to Jill's ranch empty, this is still exempt time under the 150. The sole purpose of this 150, particularly for livestock haulers, is that the process of loading animals onto a trailer is not always a fast process. And you are also not driving. And in some cases, the person loading the animals is also not the driver. The driver does have the ability in a lot of cases to be resting. And so why should they be charged for their hours of service if they're not actually driving behind the wheel? So the 150 is certainly very helpful. Through this process, NCBA and other livestock groups submitted comments, and we were really hoping to get a little more wiggle room with this guidance, to the point where if I pick up at one market and then I pick up more cattle at a second market, all of that time would the 150 would start over at the last market that I picked up at. They were not open to that. So essentially, this 150 covers your time where your truck leaves in the morning, the time for loading the cattle, and then you have 150 air miles, which is 172 road miles to drive before you're supposed to turn your ELD on or write down in your logbook that your hours of service starts at that point. So this is certainly a helpful thing. We have made multiple attempts and will continue to work with Congress to try to get another 150 air mile exemption on the back end of hauls. For the very same reason that we need it on the front end, it all comes back to flexibility and the fact that we're hauling a live animal. We've been working with members on both sides of the aisle, both in the House and Senate, to get 150 air mile exemption on the back end. And this would again apply to anyone hauling ag commodities, which obviously brings a lot of member support. We have been very close a couple of times, and we will continue to push for that because that really would be very helpful to have the flexibility on the back end. If you are almost to your final destination to offload and you need, 30 extra minutes and you don't have any buffer at the back end, what we continue to tell FMCSA is when you're hauling live animals, there has to be flexibility because you cannot stop on the side of the road and rest for 10 hours. So just to reiterate, current hours of service are 11 hours of drive time, 14 hours on duty, and then a 10-hour rest. And again, our biggest talking point is that if we have a driver that runs out of hours and has nowhere to stop and offload, which is a huge issue in the industry, we can't sit on the side of the road for 10 hours. We can't sit in the Walmart parking lot for 10 hours. We can't sit at a rest stop for 10 hours fully loaded with animals. We have to be worried about weather and humidity and other issues, and we need flexibility when we're hauling live animals. I think that's why you've seen Congress understand the need to give us more time to continue to work through these issues. So one of the ways that we are working through hours of service is through legislation on the Hill. We had two bills that were obviously still in the 115th Congress. We are moving into a lame duck session, but we have two bills, 2938 and 6079. We were grateful to Senator Sass for leading the Senate bill, and we have two veterinarians in Congress. One of them is Congressman Yoho of Florida, and he is the lead on the House bill. This bill was essentially the biggest wish list. It's a lot of drive time, but we were still able, as you can see, to get plenty of Democrat support as well as many Republican members to be co-sponsors of these bills. 300 air miles on the front end of the haul, 15 to 18 hours of drive time. Not everybody's going to need the full 18, but we wanted to give the option. Again, both of these bills stress that rest is important. We want our drivers, if they are tired, we want people to be able to stop and take that quick cat nap if the weather is right, if there's not a lot of traffic, if they're in a good spot to pull over and rest for a few minutes. But we don't want people racing against the clock. And we found that we've seen that in other portions of the trucking industry, that the ELDs have unfortunately caused a lot of racing against the clock mentality. This bill also adds 150 air miles at the back end, which again, I said we're still working on. And then the rest time is based on how many hours you actually end up driving. And again, these bills, they have not made it through committee because both the House and Senate transportation committees had a little bit of a tough time with these, but we definitely wanted to put the biggest ask forward and then work from there. So one of the biggest issues that we're focusing on now, like I said, we started off, a lot of our producers did not like the ELDs. We are sitting in an exemption. We are grateful for that. We do tell people that eventually you will have to use the ELDs more than likely. That is just where this country is going towards the electronic side of things and getting away from paper. But the ELDs have to work for us. There has to be devices on the market that work for those hauling agriculture and livestock. We have seen recently there has been a device that's come on the market from a company out of Missouri within the last couple months that's specific to agriculture, specific in the fact that it has the buttons necessary on the device to take into account the 150 air mile exemption. Earlier, FMCSA was telling our producers to just simply turn the device off when you started your 150 and just to turn it back on when you finished. That's not what that's not what we need. We need devices that are actually on the market and useful for our producers. So with that mindset that eventually we will all have to be using the ELDs, we want to focus on the bigger issue at hand, and that is flexibility in hours of service and getting hours of service correct. You've seen recently the FMCSA has been holding a lot of listening sessions and talking about something called a proposed rulemaking. And a lot of those issues are based on the rest of the trucking industry on doing away with the 30-minute rest break, which livestock haulers already are exempt from. Another thing that they've discussed is a split sleeper berth. And again, a split sleeper berth for our haulers would have to be extremely flexible, which were the comments that NCBA submitted. No more than a 2-hour breakup of that 10 hours of rest. It would have to be in very small increments. And then on top of submitting those comments to FMCSA, we also submitted a petition recently with our friends at Farm Bureau, the Livestock Marketing Association, honeybee haulers, and our fish hauler friends from the South. And we submitted this petition to FMCSA specifically on hours of service. So essentially this petition would go, if granted, would go into place it would exempt livestock haulers from the current hours of service, and in place would put 15 hours of drive time, 16 on duty, and 10 hours of rest. Now these numbers are based off of an Australian long haul program. The Australians, which we submitted all this documentation with the petition, the Australians have very strong safety numbers in this drive time. And on top of that, our request also includes a few things that we are willing to do in place of that drive time. Some of those things are things that you saw in the BQAT. We certainly referenced that. I think that shows that our industry is willing to voluntarily do as much as we can to make sure that we're doing things safely. Again, the main purpose of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration is to maintain safety on the highways. So when we go into something like this petition, we have to be able to show that if our haulers move to these hours of service, we have to be able to maintain safety. So what would happen if this petition were granted? We would be able to have this drive time for 5 years. People would be able to have this drive time if they have chosen to do a little bit of extra fatigue management training. A lot of people already do the pre-trip planning, but that's certainly a part of it. So essentially completing a safe driving plan before each haul, completing a fitness for duty assessment, which would be a self-assessment, and then some type of training developed by us in consultation with FMCSA that addresses the fatigue countermeasures. Because again, one of the biggest issues on the road with incidents is due to driver fatigue. So we talk about BQAT when we talk to FMCSA, we talk about our willingness to put our best foot forward and to do some training, and then we reference the BQAT. This would go into place for 5 years. People who chose to do those things I just mentioned would be able to drive 15 hours and 16 on duty. If you didn't want to do the training, then you wouldn't get the 15 hours. It would be very, very simple. In return, after those 5 years are up, FMCSA will take that safety data, and if they feel like the industry has done so in a safe manner, then we would there would be a rulemaking and we would have those hours permanent. Again, this can all be done through DOT and FMCSA. This petition dropped a couple weeks ago and it has not been posted in the Federal Register. It should be posted within the next 2 weeks. After it's posted, it will open up a 30-day comment period, which is always the fun part. All of the groups out there, including the safety groups and others that don't want to see us driving longer, even though we know we need it, will get a chance to comment to DOT. DOT will take those comments into consideration before they decide how to move forward on our petition. Again, this is kind of this is a very big step, this petition, and so we are excited to see where it goes next. Are there any questions?
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Allison, for that update. So we'll go ahead and take some time for questions. Go ahead and use the chat box feature of Zoom to communicate your question, and we'll address that with our two speakers. As people are starting to type in there, just kind of wanted to start off with, you mentioned that we always focus on we're hauling live animals and the concerns that go along with that. Has all of the politicians and the groups been receptive to that, or what might be some of those challenges they're bringing up in terms of the animal welfare component? Sure.
So I would say that it's been a challenge to explain the needs of our industry to DOT. A lot of the individuals that work over at DOT, whether they are political appointees or people that have been there for years and years, they don't understand agriculture, and they certainly don't understand the livestock industry. So we have had to go over there and really kind of start from scratch and walk them through what a typical day looks like and what the needs are, and also why we move animals the way we do and why we have to move them where we do. We have used a lot of great maps. We've used our friends at USDA and AMS. We've used our friends at AMS to talk about the economic impact of the ELDs originally. And just to kind of remind people that if they enjoy that steak on their plate, you know, they need to be willing to give us some flexibility and work with us. I think Congress has done a better job of understanding the animal welfare piece. I would say Republicans and Democrats. The economics is certainly very important, and I know it's important to everyone on that's joined this webinar. But at the same time, that animal welfare piece is also very important to many different groups of people. Now, when you throw the safety groups in there, their biggest concern is keeping people safe on the highways. And so that throws in another piece of the puzzle. But I think the one thing that pretty much everyone can agree on is that we need flexibility when we're hauling live animals.
That sounds good. Chase, kind of a question to you. You mentioned that fitness of travel and biosecurity were some of those topics within the BQA transportation training that sometimes the drivers may feel are maybe less applicable to the current cattle industry. Can you elaborate on that a little bit and share some of the feedback drivers might be sharing with you?
Threat. I think that we still have actually probably a lot of education to do around that in regards to what it could look like. I mean, many of you may be familiar with a lot of the biosecurity principles that are applied to other livestock species. And if we were to have a foreign animal disease outbreak that reached cattle, we could have to implement some of those. And so it's going to take a lot of communication efforts, even outside of a BQAT program, but hopefully by exposing them through that, they get it. And I think we've had some of those conversations with people when we do some of those in-person trainings, you know, where they say, that doesn't make sense, or I would never do that. But when we talk them through it and say, look, this is not necessarily every day, you need to be cognizant of the risks associated with everything you do around biosecurity. But in the event that we needed to implement these strategies, we want you to be aware of them so that you can apply them and keep the health and well-being and honestly the economic viability of our industry at the forefront of our mind if we needed to implement those. And then in regards to fitness for transport, I think we're hearing a lot. I get a lot of feedback from drivers that say, you know, there's a lot of cattle I don't want to haul, or I don't think I should be hauling, but I don't really have a choice, or things like that. Well, that's where we're really trying to help and encourage that line of communication even before the process starts. You know, are your cattle, you know, fit to take this trip? This is how far they're going to go, and this is where they could go beyond that. You know, and then also for the producer to say, okay, you're picking up my cattle. Do you have the right equipment? Are we going to be able to load, you know, one of the more vulnerable animals, you know, last on, first off sort of situation, and how far are they going? Where are they going? So I think a lot of actual positive feedback in regards to that fitness for transport conversation, as I like to frame it up. It's truly a conversation where haulers and producers and all of those kind of in the chain need to communicate with each other around what can be done to improve that. So I hope that kind of answers your question there.
Yeah, thank you. I did share a poll with everybody, so if you want to, as you're working on your questions, just answer those couple of questions that come up on your screen there in the webinar. And maybe just kind of, for Allison, you mentioned some of the devices that are currently on the market. One, there's a lot of them, so maybe they are not all functioning the same. What do we need more from on the device side to help with the current regulations?
Well, you know, the problem is that FMCSA, being a government entity, can't help people decide what device to buy, what works best for them, and instead they've had to allow these companies out there to self-comply, if you will. And so FMCSA is having to take these many companies' words that they have a solid product and that it meets you know, it meets the standard of what's needed. And I think that the fact that there's over 300 devices on the market for haulers to choose from kind of shows that it maybe got a little out of hand, if you will. I think this company that's recently come out with this ag-specific device, one of the complaints from myself and groups like Farm Bureau and pork producers from the very beginning to DOT was, you've got all these devices. Congress gave 150 air mile exemption to those hauling ag commodities. Those hauling ag commodities are a good number of trucks on the road, and you have no device that really works for them or takes these exemptions into consideration. And you've got people telling producers just to turn the device off. Well, what's the point of making them have the device if it doesn't work for them, and if you're going to suggest that they simply turn it off? So I think that we have said from the beginning that also those who are hauling livestock and possibly those hauling ag commodities were maybe not part of a lot of these larger trucking groups. You have a lot of small and independent operators And so the message about the ELDs at the beginning was certainly not even getting to people, because a lot of the big companies had maybe been using these devices for a while and they had devices that worked for them. But one of our complaints was the lack of outreach specifically on the devices and what would be best for people to the ag community. And when we asked for outreach, you know, some of DOT's ideas maybe were not the best. And so we tried to kind of help them. I think that all of the industry groups in DC probably were the ones that really got the message out. But also just insisting to them that they do a little bit more to make sure that there were devices available to our haulers. If they're going to make us use them, then they need to work for us as well. And again, we're just very different from anyone else on the road hauling boxes of toilet paper, as I like to say.
No, great. Thank you for that feedback. And kind of the last question to end here for each of you, just share your thoughts. What is some recommendations of how to frame up these animal well-being concerns around transportation with our audiences when we are in roles of, say, extension or maybe members of industry to really help producers either understand or better communicate this to the general public? I'll have Allison, maybe if you want to lead off, and then we'll have Chase provide his comments.
Okay. I would say when people are out there talking about this issue, I always talk about the fact that we appreciate the work that we're doing with FMCSA and that their role is to keep the highways safe, but our producers and the haulers of our cattle, their job is also to get animals safely where they need to go. Now, we want our drivers to be fit. We want the cattle on the trailer to be fit for travel, and we want the drivers to be safe. We always say that we're concerned about safety as well. We're concerned about the safety of the driver, of others on the road, but we have this other piece where we have to be worried about the safety of the live animals that we're hauling. And so I think constantly reminding people that you know, we all want to be good actors. We have a very strong safety record, which is very helpful when talking to DOT. And just to remind people that we have a strong safety record, and that's because we have animals in the trailer to keep safe. And there's a sense of pride in getting those animals where they need to go safely, and we're going to continue to maintain that.
Yeah, and I think you know, similarly, everyone is acting with the goal in mind of doing the right thing and doing it responsibly. And as an industry, we take that seriously. And obviously those that you're talking to are likely taking that seriously too. We need to work together to make sure we're taking the right steps, to know what proper transportation looks like. We're doing that. We have programs in place to do that. We can prove that and apply those principles to everyday work. So I think really just framing it up as obviously everyone is a piece of something larger than themselves, and we can all benefit by doing the right thing. And ultimately, so many of our producers spend so much time and effort in caring for these animals day in and day out. Why would we want to, you know, lose so much of that effort by potentially not doing the right thing when we're transporting them? Let's see it. Let's see that proper care all the way through the end, and use the programs and the knowledge that we have to do that to the best of our ability.
Well, great. I want to thank both of you for providing your thoughts and your updates on the transportation programs. As a reminder, we'll have our December Animal Care Wednesday webinar on December 5th at 11 o'clock Central Time. Topic there is an update on the One Health initiative that's going on in South Dakota, which is also a national initiative. And we'll have presenters Dr. Russ Daly, an extension veterinarian, and also Dr. Susan Anderson from the human health field, just presenting on that. So look forward to having you join us in December. And until then, I wish you a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.